I never imagined my life would take such a turn, one that I would never dare to confess to anyone. My name is Emily, and I'm 29 years old. I've been married to Derek for 5 years, and on the surface, we have what everyone would call a perfect life. But what lies beneath the surface is where things start to get complicated. Derek and I live in a beautiful suburban home with his father, Richard, a retired architect in his late 60s. Richard is the kind of man everyone respects, calm, composed, and full of wisdom. He's the mediator when Derek and I have our occasional disagreements, especially about having children. Derek wants to start a family, but I'm not ready. I've been focused on my career and enjoying the freedom of not having those responsibilities just yet. One evening, after a particularly busy day at work, I returned home feeling drained. Derek had gone out to meet some friends, leaving Richard and me alone in the house. I decided to take a relaxing shower, hoping to wash away the exhaustion of the day. Afterward, I chose a simple but elegant navy blue dress to wear. It had a zipper that ran from the middle of my back to the nape of my neck. As I stood in front of the mirror trying to zip it up, I realized it was stuck. No matter how hard I tugged, it refused to move. Frustrated, I thought about waiting for Derek to come home, but the evening heat was unbearable, and I didn't want to sit around in my towel. I hesitated before walking into the living room where Richard sat reading. His glasses rested on the tip of his nose, and he looked up as I entered. "Emily, everything okay?" he asked, his voice warm and steady. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. Finally, I managed. "The zipper on my dress is stuck. Could you help me, please?" For a moment, Richard seemed surprised, but then he nodded, placing his book on the side table. "Of course," he said, standing up and walking over to me. I turned around, feeling his presence close behind me. His hands, strong but gentle, reached for the zipper. As he tried to work it free, I felt his breath lightly graze the back of my neck, sending an unexpected shiver down my spine. My heart started to race, and I couldn't understand why. It was just a simple moment, wasn't it? "It's caught in the fabric," Richard murmured, his voice soft and focused. He tugged carefully, but the zipper suddenly gave way, and the dress slipped off my shoulders, cascading to the floor. I froze. The room seemed to stand still. I was standing there in nothing but my undergarments, and Richard's gaze flickered, betraying a moment of hesitation before he quickly turned away. "I'm so sorry," he stammered, his voice filled with guilt. "I didn't mean for that to happen." It's fine," I replied, hastily pulling the dress back up. My cheeks burned with embarrassment, but there was something else lingering in the air, something unspoken. Neither of us said another word as he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and the unmistakable feeling that a line had been crossed. The atmosphere in the house felt different after that evening. I tried to brush it off as an embarrassing accident, but the memory lingered, vivid and unshakable. I avoided Richard the next day, hoping the awkwardness would naturally fade. He seemed to do the same, keeping himself busy in his study or outside in the garden. Derek, oblivious to the growing tension, was his usual cheerful self. At breakfast, he chatted about his plans for the weekend while I quietly sipped my coffee, nodding at the right moments. Richard remained silent, his gaze fixed on the newspaper, but I could feel his occasional glance in my direction. Each time, I pretended not to notice, focusing intently on my plate. The days passed, but the unease between us only grew. One evening, Derek left for an overnight work trip, leaving Richard and me alone again. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that I'd stay in my room and avoid any unnecessary interaction. But as the evening wore on, the silence in the house became stifling. I decided to distract myself by tidying up the living room. As I dusted the shelves and straightened the cushions, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Richard standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I thought you might need some company," he said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. I forced a smile. "Thanks, but I'm just keeping busy." He nodded, stepping further into the room. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone calm but direct. The comment caught me off guard. "I haven't," I replied too quickly, my voice betraying me. "Emily," he said, sitting down on the armrest of a nearby chair, "about the other night. I never meant to make you uncomfortable." "I know," I said softly, my hands gripping the edge of the duster. "It was just an accident." "It was," he agreed, but there was something in his tone that made me look up. His eyes held mine for a moment too long, and I felt the same strange tension I'd felt that night. "I should get back to cleaning," I said, turning away abruptly. As I reached for a book on the shelf, my hand trembled, and it slipped from my grasp. Richard moved quickly, catching it before it hit the floor. He was close, too close. I could feel the warmth of his presence, and when I turned to take the book from him, our hands brushed. The contact was brief but electric. I pulled back as though burned, but neither of us moved to break the silence. His eyes searched mine, and I saw something there I didn't want to acknowledge, something I couldn't. "Emily," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't," I interrupted, stepping back. "We shouldn't, this is wrong." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling heavily. "I know," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "But I can't pretend I don't feel it." The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating and undeniable. I shook my head, backing toward the door. "I'm going to bed," I said, my voice trembling. As I climbed the stairs, my mind raced. This wasn't just an accident anymore. Something dangerous was unfolding, and I didn't know how to stop it. I spent most of the next day in my room, trying to figure out what was happening. I told myself it was just tension, a misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The look in Richard's eyes the previous night wasn't something I could easily dismiss. It wasn't just guilt or regret, it was desire. And worse, I had felt something too. Derek returned that evening, cheerful as ever, kissing me on the forehead as he dropped his bag by the door. "How was everything while I was gone?" he asked, his usual warm smile lighting up his face. "Fine," I lied, forcing a smile of my own. "Quiet. Dad didn't drive you crazy, did he?" he joked. I shook my head, laughing nervously. "No, he mostly kept to himself." Richard entered the room at that moment, greeting Derek with a hearty handshake and a pat on the back. His demeanor was calm, collected, exactly what you'd expect from him. But when his eyes briefly met mine, I felt the air shift. It was subtle, but it was there. A tension that only the two of us seemed to recognize. Dinner that night was uneventful, but I could barely eat. Every glance, every word exchanged between Richard and me felt loaded with unspoken meaning. I excused myself early, retreating to the sanctuary of my bedroom. But even there, I couldn't escape the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Later that night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as Derek snored softly beside me. My mind replayed the events of the past few days over and over, each memory sharper than the last. I thought about the zipper incident, the conversation in the living room, the way his hand had brushed mine. I hated the way my body reacted to the thoughts, how my heart raced, how my skin tingled. I was startled out of my thoughts by a faint knock on the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Derek stirred slightly but didn't wake, so I slipped out of bed and opened the door just a crack. Richard stood there, his face shadowed in the dim light of the hallway. "I need to talk to you," he whispered. I shook my head, my voice barely audible. "Not now. Derek's here." "Please, Emily," he said, his tone urgent. "Just for a moment." Against my better judgment, I stepped into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind me. "What are you doing?" I hissed, keeping my voice low. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of desperation and regret. "I can't keep ignoring this. I need to know if you feel it too." My stomach flipped, and I stepped back, shaking my head. "Richard, this is insane. You're Derek's father. I'm his wife. Whatever this is, it can't happen." "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice raw. "But that doesn't make it any less real." I felt tears prick my eyes as I tried to steady my breathing. "You need to stop. We both do. This will ruin everything." He reached out as if to touch me but stopped himself, his hand hovering in the air. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I needed to say it." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the dark hallway. I leaned against the wall, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. My entire world felt like it was unraveling, and I didn't know how to stop it. The following morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The encounter in the hallway played over and over in my mind, every word and glance haunting me. Derek was already up and in the kitchen, humming as he prepared coffee. I envied his obliviousness. How I wished I could wipe the last few days from my memory and go back to how things used to be. As I joined him for breakfast, I kept my answers short, avoiding eye contact. I couldn't let him see the guilt written all over my face. Richard entered the room shortly after, his expression unreadable. He greeted us both casually, as if nothing had happened the night before. I wished I could do the same, but every time our eyes met, I felt a sharp jolt of anxiety. Derek kissed me on the cheek before heading out to run errands. "I'll be back in a few hours," he said cheerfully. "You two don't get into too much trouble without me." The moment the door closed behind him, the tension in the room became unbearable. I busied myself with cleaning up the dishes, hoping Richard would retreat to his study like he usually did. But instead, he stayed. "Emily," he said quietly. I didn't turn around. "I don't want to talk about it." "I know," he replied, his voice closer now. "But we need to." I set the plate I was holding back in the sink and turned to face him. "What do you want me to say, Richard? That this is okay? That I don't feel guilty? Because I do." His jaw tightened, and he looked down at the floor. "I feel guilty too. But I can't stop thinking about you." "Stop," I said, my voice cracking. "You have to stop saying things like that. It's not fair." "Do you think this is fair to me?" he asked, his tone more intense now. "Do you think I wanted to feel this way?" I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "None of this matters, Richard. What matters is that we don't let this go any further." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, suffocating. And then, before I could react, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, just like before. I pulled away instinctively, but he didn't move. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know you feel it too." I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt my body betray me as my heart raced and my breath quickened. "This has to stop," I managed, my voice trembling. "For Derek. For the family." He nodded, stepping back. "You're right," he said, though his eyes said otherwise. "It has to stop." I thought that would be the end of it, that his retreat would finally give me the distance I needed. But as he turned and walked away, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that this was far from over. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I stayed in my room, telling myself that avoiding Richard was the only way to regain control. But the tension in the house had become a living, breathing thing. I could feel it every time I ventured into the hallway, every time I heard his footsteps nearby. When Derek returned that evening, I tried to act normal, but my smiles felt forced, my laughter hollow. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did and didn't want to press the issue. Either way, I was grateful for the reprieve. Richard, on the other hand, avoided both of us, retreating to his study and staying there until well past dinner. That night, as I lay in bed beside Derek, I found myself staring at the ceiling again, my thoughts spinning out of control. I told myself I needed to get past this, to let it go and focus on my marriage. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The connection I felt with Richard, as wrong as it was, refused to be ignored. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of faint footsteps outside my room. I glanced at the clock. 2 a.m. Derek was sound asleep beside me, his breathing slow and steady. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me, and I slipped out of bed. The hallway was dimly lit, the faint glow of a nightlight casting long shadows on the walls. I followed the sound of the footsteps to the kitchen, where I found Richard standing by the counter, pouring himself a glass of water. He looked up as I entered, his expression startled but softening almost immediately. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, my arms wrapped around myself. "No. You." He let out a quiet sigh. "Not really." We stood there in silence for a moment, the tension between us palpable. I told myself to leave, to go back to my room and pretend I hadn't seen him. But my feet wouldn't move. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you," he said finally, his voice breaking the stillness. "I know I've crossed a line." "You did," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "And so did I." He set the glass down on the counter and turned to face me fully. "Then why are you here?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Why was I here? Why hadn't I just stayed in bed and let the moment pass? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I felt the pull, the same magnetic force that had been building between us since that first night. "Richard," I whispered, shaking my head. "We can't." But before I could finish, he closed the distance between us, his hand brushing against my arm. The contact sent a shiver through me, and I hated how much I wanted more. His eyes searched mine, silently asking for permission, and against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I didn't pull away. The kiss was slow, tentative at first, as if testing the boundaries we were so dangerously close to destroying. But it quickly deepened, the weight of our unspoken feelings crashing over us like a tidal wave. In that moment, nothing else existed, no Derek, no consequences, just the two of us and the fire we couldn't seem to extinguish. When it ended, we both pulled back, breathless and wide-eyed. Reality came crashing down around me, and I stepped away, my hand covering my mouth. "This was a mistake," I said, my voice trembling. "A huge mistake." He didn't argue. He just stood there, his expression a mix of guilt and longing. "I know," he said softly, "but I don't regret it." I turned and fled the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. Back in my room, I slipped into bed beside Derek, my mind racing with what had just happened. I knew I couldn't keep this secret forever, but I also knew the truth would destroy everything. For now, all I could do was pretend and hope the cracks wouldn't show. The days that followed were unbearable. Every time I saw Richard, the memory of that kiss replayed in my mind. I tried to focus on my routines, to bury myself in tasks, but nothing seemed to quiet the chaos inside me. Derek remained blissfully unaware, his cheerful demeanor a constant reminder of how much I stood to lose. Richard and I avoided being alone together, though that did little to ease the tension. When we crossed paths, the air between us was heavy with unspoken words. I could feel his gaze lingering on me, and despite my best efforts, my own eyes often betrayed me, searching for him when I knew I shouldn't. One evening, Derek suggested a family movie night. "It's been a while since we all sat down together," he said, pulling out a stack of DVDs. "What do you think, Dad?" Richard hesitated, his eyes flicking toward me before he nodded. "Sure, sounds good." We all settled in the living room, Derek in his usual spot on the couch, me beside him, and Richard in the recliner. The movie was a light-hearted comedy, but I couldn't concentrate. Every laugh from Derek felt like a dagger, reminding me of the betrayal I was hiding. Halfway through the movie, Derek fell asleep, his head resting on my shoulder. I glanced over at Richard, who was watching me instead of the screen. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us looked away. The weight of his gaze sent a shiver through me, and I quickly turned back to the TV, my heart pounding. When the movie ended, Derek stirred, yawning as he stretched. "I'm heading to bed," he said, kissing my cheek. "You coming?" "I'll join you in a bit," I replied, forcing a smile. "I just need to clean up." Derek didn't question it, and after he left, I began gathering the empty popcorn bowls and glasses. Richard stayed seated, his eyes following my every move. "You don't have to help," I said, not looking at him. "I want to," he replied, standing and taking the glasses from my hands. His voice was calm, but the tension between us was anything but. We worked in silence, the only sounds the clinking of dishes and the soft hum of the dishwasher. When I turned to grab the last bowl, I found Richard standing much closer than I expected. My breath hitched, and I froze, my pulse racing. "Emily," he said softly, his tone carrying the weight of everything we weren't saying. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening." I shook my head, stepping back. "You have to. We both have to. This is wrong." "I know it is," he said, his voice raw. "But that doesn't change how I feel." His words hung in the air, and I hated how they resonated with the feelings I was trying so hard to bury. "You need to stop," I said, my voice trembling. "For Derek. For the family." "I've tried," he said, taking a step closer. "But every time I see you, every time I think about you." "Don't," I interrupted, tears welling up in my eyes. "Don't say it." But he didn't stop. "I'm in love with you, Emily." The confession hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but face the truth of what he had just said. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as he reached out to touch my hand. "I don't expect you to feel the same," he said, his voice shaking. "I just needed you to know." Tears spilled down my cheeks as I pulled my hand away. "This has to end," I whispered, "before it destroys everything." Richard nodded, his own eyes glistening. "I know, but it's already too late." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my heart breaking with every step. I knew he was right. No matter how much I wanted to believe otherwise, the damage had already been done. The tension in the house became unbearable. Every interaction with Richard was laced with a heaviness I couldn't escape, and every moment with Derek filled me with guilt. I felt like a stranger in my own life, trapped between two worlds, one of love and loyalty, and the other of forbidden desire. One morning, Derek left early for work, kissing me on the forehead before heading out the door. I stayed in the kitchen, nursing my coffee and staring blankly out the window. I didn't hear Richard enter the room until he spoke. "Good morning," he said softly. I flinched, nearly spilling my coffee. "Morning," I replied, keeping my eyes on the mug. He hesitated before stepping closer. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. "We've already said everything." "No, we haven't," he said, pulling out the chair across from me and sitting down. "I need to know where we stand." I finally looked up at him, my chest tightening at the sight of his face. There was a sadness in his eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "Richard, we don't stand anywhere," I said, trying to sound firm. "This has to stop. It should have never started." He nodded slowly, but the intensity in his gaze didn't waver. "You're right," he said, "but that doesn't mean it's easy to walk away." I set my mug down, my hands trembling. "It's not about what's easy. It's about doing the right thing. For Derek. For this family. And what about what's right for you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you happy, Emily?" The question caught me off guard. Was I happy? I had told myself I was, but now, I wasn't so sure. I had everything I thought I wanted: a loving husband, a stable home, a promising career. But there was a part of me that felt hollow, like something was missing. "I'm not doing this with you," I said, standing abruptly. "This conversation is over." As I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. "Do you love him?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I spun around, my anger flaring. "How dare you ask me that?" "Because I need to know," he said, standing as well. "I need to know if I'm the only one feeling this way." "You're not," I blurted before I could stop myself. The words hung in the air, raw and undeniable. My cheeks flushed with shame as I realized what I had just admitted. Richard took a step closer, his expression softening. "Emily." "No," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't. Please don't." But he didn't stop. He closed the distance between us, his hand gently brushing my arm. "I can't let this go," he said, his voice trembling. "Not when I know you feel it too." I wanted to push him away, to tell him he was wrong. But my body betrayed me again, leaning into his touch instead of pulling away. His hand moved to my cheek, his thumb grazing my skin, and I felt my resolve crumbling. "We can't," I whispered, my voice shaking. "This will ruin everything." "I know," he said, his forehead resting against mine. "But I don't care anymore." The kiss that followed was slow and deliberate, each movement heavy with the weight of our shared guilt and longing. It wasn't like the first, it was deeper, more intense, and completely consuming. When it ended, I pulled away, my breath ragged. "This has to stop," I said again, though my voice lacked conviction. "It won't," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Not until we face the truth." I fled the room before he could say more, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew he was right. The truth was staring us both in the face, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it wasn't going away. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to avoid Richard at all costs, but the house wasn't big enough to keep our paths from crossing. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands, sent a fresh wave of guilt through me. But it wasn't enough to extinguish the feelings that had taken root. Derek, as usual, remained completely unaware. His carefree attitude only made my guilt worse, but it also served as a shield. As long as he didn't suspect anything, I could pretend that everything was normal, even if it was tearing me apart inside. One afternoon, Derek mentioned he'd be working late on a big project. I nodded, trying not to let my anxiety show. I knew what an empty house meant, and I wasn't sure if I could handle it. When Derek left, I busied myself with household chores, anything to keep my mind occupied. But as the hours dragged on, I found myself pacing the living room, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Richard appeared in the doorway, his expression hesitant. "I thought you might be here," he said quietly. I stiffened, my heart racing. "Derek's working late," I said, as if that explained anything. He nodded but didn't move. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything we weren't saying. I turned my back to him, pretending to adjust a photo frame on the shelf. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low. I didn't respond. What could I say? That I was scared of what might happen if I didn't? "I can't do this anymore, Emily," he continued, stepping further into the room. Pretending like I don't feel this. I spun around, my frustration boiling over. "You think this is easy for me? You think I don't feel guilty every second of every day? Then why are you fighting it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why not just admit what we both know is true?" "Because it's wrong," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Because if Derek ever found out—" "He doesn't have to," Richard interrupted, taking a step closer. "This doesn't have to change anything." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "How can you say that? It's already changed everything." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The contact sent a shiver through me, and I hated how much I wanted more. "Emily," he said softly, his voice pleading. "I can't stop thinking about you." "I don't want to stop." I pulled my hand away, tears stinging my eyes. "This isn't about what we want. It's about what's right." "And what if this is right?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we're meant to feel this way?" I shook my head, backing away. Don't. Please don't. But he didn't stop. He closed the distance between us, his hand cupping my cheek. Tell me you don't feel the same, he said, his eyes searching mine. Look me in the eye and tell me you don't want this. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt myself leaning into his touch, my body betraying me once again. The kiss that followed was desperate, filled with all the emotions we had been trying to suppress. When it ended, I pulled away, my breath shaky. This has to be the last time, I said, though I didn't believe my own words. Richard nodded, but his eyes told a different story. If that's what you want. I turned and left the room, my heart pounding. I knew I was playing with fire, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care. The line had already been crossed, and there was no turning back. I could feel the weight of my choices crushing me. Every stolen glance, every whispered word, every moment I allowed myself to give in, they all chipped away at the life I had worked so hard to build. And yet, I couldn't stop. The pull toward Richard was too strong, and the more I fought it, the more it consumed me. Derek's late nights at work became a constant, giving Richard and me more opportunities to be alone. I hated the excuses I made to justify my actions, but in those moments, when it was just the two of us, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. One evening, Derek called to say he'd be working late again. I tried to focus on cooking dinner, but my hands trembled as I chopped vegetables. I knew what the evening might bring, and a part of me dreaded it as much as I anticipated it. Richard entered the kitchen, his presence as magnetic as ever. Need some help? He asked, his voice calm but carrying that familiar undercurrent. No, I've got it, I said, my voice unsteady. He didn't leave. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for a knife. The simple touch sent a jolt through me, and I dropped the vegetable I was holding. He caught it before it hit the floor, his hand lingering on mine as he straightened. Emily, he said softly, his voice filled with something I couldn't quite place. I pulled my hand away, stepping back. We can't keep doing this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I know, he replied, but his eyes told a different story. But that doesn't mean I don't want to. Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his hands gently gripping my arms. Tell me you don't feel it too, he said, his voice raw with emotion. Tell me this isn't real. I tried to speak, to push him away, but his words struck a chord deep inside me. The truth was I did feel it. I felt it every time he was near, every time he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. Richard, this is wrong, I said, my voice trembling. We'll destroy everything. Maybe everything's already broken, he said, his forehead resting against mine. Maybe this is the only thing that makes sense. His words unraveled what little resolve I had left. I knew I should walk away, but instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands gripping his shirt as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. When his lips met mine, it was as if the world around us ceased to exist. The kiss was desperate, filled with the weight of everything we were risking. This time we didn't stop. The boundaries we had tried so hard to maintain shattered completely, leaving nothing but the raw intensity of the moment. The guilt would come later, I knew, but for now I was lost in him. When it was over, the reality of what we had done hit me like a tidal wave. I pulled away, my breath shaky, and avoided his gaze. This can't happen again, I said, though the words felt hollow. Richard nodded, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. I don't want to hurt you, he said softly. But I can't promise that I won't. I didn't respond. Instead, I left the kitchen, retreating to my room and locking the door behind me. I pressed my back against it, my chest heaving as I tried to process what had just happened. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to give, and soon. But I also knew that whatever happened next, there was no going back. The damage was already done, and the consequences were waiting just around the corner. The next morning, I woke with a heavy sense of dread. The weight of my actions pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't look at Derek as we had breakfast, his cheerful conversation a painful reminder of what I was betraying. Richard stayed silent, his eyes downcast, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. I knew this couldn't continue. The tangled web of lies and betrayal was growing thicker by the day, and sooner or later, it would unravel. I had to end it for Derek's sake, for Richard's, and for my own sanity. After Derek left for work, I found Richard in the garden, trimming the hedges. He looked up when he saw me, his expression unreadable. I hesitated for a moment before walking over, my heart pounding with every step. We need to talk, I said, my voice firm despite the lump in my throat. He nodded, setting down the shears. I know. We went inside, sitting at the kitchen table where it had all begun. The silence between us was deafening, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. This has to stop, I said finally, my voice trembling. We've gone too far. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and regret. I know we have, he said softly, but that doesn't make it any easier. It doesn't matter, I said, forcing myself to stay strong. What we've done, it's unforgivable. I can't live with this guilt anymore. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Don't, I said, my voice breaking. Please, Richard, don't make this harder than it already is. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. I never meant for this to happen, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't pretend I don't care about you. I care about you too, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. But this isn't love, Richard. It's a mistake, and we have to fix it before it destroys everything. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. You're right, he said. We need to end this. Relief and heartbreak washed over me simultaneously. I stood, wiping my eyes. I think it's best if Derek and I move out, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. We need space to rebuild, to heal. Richard nodded again, his expression pained. I understand. Later that evening, I told Derek my decision. I framed it as a desire for independence, for a fresh start as a couple. He was hesitant at first, but Richard supported the idea, surprising Derek with his encouragement. The move happened quickly. Within a week, Derek and I had found a small apartment across town. On the day we left, Richard helped load the car, his interactions with me brief and distant. When it was time to say goodbye, he hugged Derek tightly, then turned to me. Take care of yourself, he said quietly. You too, I replied, my voice barely audible. As we drove away, I couldn't stop the tears from falling. I had made the right choice, but it didn't make the pain any less real. I had lost something I couldn't even name, and the scars it left would stay with me forever. The days turned into weeks, and life began to settle into a new routine. Derek remained blissfully unaware of the storm that had passed, and I did everything I could to focus on our marriage. But in the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, the memories would return, haunting me with what could never be. Looking back, I realized the truth of what I had learned. Boundaries, once crossed, can never truly be rebuilt. The scars remain, a reminder of the cost of giving in to temptation. I could only hope that with time, I would find peace, and that I would never make the same mistake again.